Hey, welcome to Restoration. I'm Matt. So glad you could join us on this Shabbat or whatever day you are watching. We are finishing today our series on the book of Ruth, which we began before Shavuot and the counting of the 50 days of Omer between Passover and Shavuot. And as Jewish tradition dictates, we read the book of Ruth on Shavuot. And so we spent several weeks, 6 total, going through the book of Ruth. And we said throughout that the story of Ruth is simple, but it's never simplistic. And it's a story of brokenness and pain and suffering of human beings, and how God redeems the whole world through the ordinary and mundane details of their lives. The JPS commentary says the story traces a journey from Bethlehem and back, a journey from famine to fullness, from futility to fertility. And God is still working today through hurting, broken, selfish, manipulating people, just like Naomi and Ruth and Boaz, and just like you and me. So today we are in part 6 of the last message of the series of Ruth, and today's message is just called Filled Full. Ruth chapter 4 and verse 13, it says, "So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife, and when he went to her, Adonai enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son." So Ruth and Boaz marry, and she becomes his wife, and they have a baby. And she is like Tamar and Rachel and Leah as one who built up the house of Israel. We talked about that last week in verse 11. And she joined the people of Israel. At the very least, it certainly can sound like she has become Jewish. And here at the end of the story, Ruth is not called a Moabite. She is, along with the commitment that she makes to Naomi in chapter 1, this story, perhaps more than any other in the Bible, especially in Judaism, is used as an example of a Gentile converting to Judaism. Of course, there is really nothing in the Hebrew Bible that talks about Gentiles becoming Jewish. A non-Israelite changing or converting to Israelite. For many Jewish people, for Orthodox Judaism, that's how the book of Ruth is read today. But the events of Ruth are far before conversion to Judaism becomes a real thing. Conversion is actually an invention of the Pharisees around 164 BC, 164 years before the birth of Yeshua, in the time of the Hasmoneans, the Maccabees. Antiochus Epiphanes, the leader of the Seleucids, was the first foreign king to conquer Judea and force Jewish people to stop the circumcision of our 8-day-old sons, to stop keeping kosher, stop celebrating the Shabbat, and stop celebrating the holy days. And when the Maccabees defeated the Seleucids, they took Judea back. This is where we get the celebration of Hanukkah. But what's surprising to many is after the first Hanukkah, about 2 years later, the Hasmoneans are awful. The Maccabees are awful. They conquered Judea, Samaria, and the Galilee, and for the first time in 2,000 years of Jewish history, they force convert the Gentiles they conquer through circumcision. About 2,000 years into Jewish history, circumcision becomes an identifier of Jewishness. It changes everything, because some of the people they convert are a part of the Idumeans, the great-grandparents of Herod the Great. And Herod is the disputed king of Judea who's appointed by Rome at the birth of Yeshua. And what Ruth and Boaz are doing is what all the patriarchs in the story of Ruth is what all the patriarchs and matriarchs did before them. All of the key characters in the Torah marry foreigners. They marry Gentiles, people from other nations. Abram is the first Hebrew. So when he marries Sarah, she is a non-Hebrew. Isaac marries Rebekah, and Rebekah was the daughter of Bethuel, the Aramean from Padan Aram, not Jewish. Rebekah's brother is Laban, who's also an Aramean, and he has 2 daughters, Rachel and Leah. Of course, they are not Hebrews, but they both marry Jacob. Jacob has 12 sons, the 12 tribes of Israel, and through actually not just his Gentile wives, but through their Gentile concubines, 4 non-Hebrew women, Rachel, Leah, Bilhah, Zilpah. Judah, we talked about last week, has a son with Tamar, who's a Canaanite. Joseph marries Asenath, the Egyptian, an Egyptian and daughter of an Egyptian priest. And Ephraim and Manasseh become two tribes of Israel through an Egyptian mother. Moses marries Zipporah, a Midianite, and a daughter of a Midianite high priest. And of course, Boaz marries Ruth, a Moabite. Now, Rabbinic Judaism says that all of these women converted to Judaism. But the only problem is, conversion to Judaism does not happen, does not exist until the time of the Maccabees. That's about 2,000 years too late. So, what all of these amazing women do is they leave their fathers and mothers. They leave the nation where they were born. They abandon the gods of their people, and they become a part of the house of Israel. And that happens in two ways, two parts. The first is they turn to the God of Israel. The second is they married into the family and had Jewish children, where like Ruth, they literally build the house of Israel. Shai Cohen, the Jewish historian, says that the Bible has no general prohibition against intermarriage. So what does the Bible have a general prohibition against? The Bible has a general prohibition against the worship of other gods. Anyone from any nation can turn away from the gods of their people and turn towards the God of Israel. That has always been true, and that is still true. One does not turn into a Jewish person. Like Ruth, you become a Gentile follower of the God of Israel. And when a Gentile marries into a Jewish family, they do not become Jewish, but at the same time, their children are Jewish. It's commonly known today that in Rabbinic Judaism, they say that Jewishness is passed through the mother. But if that's true, then there has never been a Jewish person after Abraham. Because all of the mothers are non-Jews in the Bible. The JPS commentary on Ruth says this regarding non-Jewish parents. It says, in the early stages of Israel's history, and also in some post-biblical sources, a person's identity was established according to the father's status, and when a man married a non-Israelite, she may have remained a foreigner, but their offspring was reckoned as Israelites. Ruth is still not Jewish at the end of the book of Ruth. She is a Moabite, and Moabites should not be allowed in the people of God according to the Torah, except when a Moabite or anyone from any nation turns to the God of Israel and rejects the gods of their people. Then they can join the people and even marry into the Jewish people. Look, Jewishness is passed down from one parent or the other. There are genetic markers of Jewishness for that reason. But what matters most, and what's always mattered most, is the heart. One can be Jewish and not worship the God of Israel, and in doing so can forfeit blessings that God has given to the Jewish people. This is why Paul, who's living in the first century world, in a Roman Hellenized world, which now has conversion through circumcision in the first century, speaks so often to these things in his letters. Like in Romans chapter 2 and verse 8, he says, "For one is not a Jew who is one outwardly, nor is circumcision something visible in the flesh. Rather, the Jew is one inwardly, and circumcision is of the heart, in spirit, not in letter. His praise is not from man, but from God." Now, just like Jesus, Paul never says anything new. He goes back to Moses, and the phrase, the circumcision of the heart, is a direct quote from Deuteronomy, where God in Deuteronomy 30 is laying out the blessings if we obey the commandments as a people, and the curses if we do not obey the commandments. And it says in Deuteronomy 30 and verse 6, "The Lord your God will circumcise your heart and the hearts of your descendants, to love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, in order that you may live." So Boaz takes Ruth, and she becomes his wife. And when he went to her, Adonai enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. You know, this is the only time that God actively does something in the book of Ruth. He's mentioned a few times as the one who brought back Naomi empty, because that's the feeling she has. It's not something active that he's doing. Or Adonai is mentioned as the one under whose wings Ruth can find safety. He's mentioned in the greetings of Boaz and his workers. God bless you. This time, he's actively doing something. He's enabled her to conceive and give birth to a son. And of course, this has all kinds of hyperlinks for Jewish people to the women of Israel, to Sarah and Rachel and Tamar and Hannah, and even in the New Testament to Miriam, the mother of Yeshua. And interestingly, Ruth does not get mentioned again in the book, in the end. The end turns where the story began in chapter 1 with the Ephrathite widow, Naomi. Because remember, in chapter 1, she felt, and her feelings were real and legitimate. She felt like God had abandoned her and had sent her away, had brought her back to Bethlehem empty, that she went away full, but God brought her back empty. And it seems that the same women she speaks to in chapter 1 in the beginning are there at the birth of Ruth's baby. And those same women from chapter 1 say in chapter 4, it says, "Then the women said to Naomi, 'Blessed be Adonai, who has not left you without a Goel today.'" Praise God. Blessed be Adonai. Praise God that he didn't stop the process and gave you the Redeemer you actually needed, they're saying to her, a son. Because as it turns out, the Goel, the Redeemer, is not even really Boaz. The Redeemer, the Goel, we've talked about the last couple weeks, is the son of Boaz and Ruth, who redeems Naomi. And they're saying God has not left you without a Goel. In other words, God didn't create more tragedy by stopping the process of a Goel. He didn't wait for a better opportunity. He set up, or he used, or he moved through the brokenness of Naomi to do something better for her than she could do for herself. Remember, up to this point in Jewish history, we talked about this last week, redeemers do not redeem people. They redeem inheritance and land. But now, because of the story of Ruth, a Goel redeems people. First Naomi, then the whole family line of Judah. Just like God redeems the Jewish people first, and then the nations, the whole world. And so the women added, "May his name, your son, may his name be famous throughout Israel." And this really just means let his name be called in Israel. Like the child will be part of the clan, part of the tribe of Judah, part of the nation of Israel, the one to continue the line to something greater, the chosen one, the special one. And the women continue in verse 15, and they say, "Moreover, he will be to you a renewer of life and a sustainer of your old age." To Naomi, they're saying, he will, your grandson, your son, they call him, he will renew and sustain you. Because Naomi felt like God brought her back empty. And he did not stop the process of providing one who would renew her life and sustain her in her old age. She was a widow and she had no hope. And God worked a plan to meet her needs. He provided one who would renew her life. That word life is the word nephesh, which often in English gets translated as soul. But nephesh means throat, because everything you need to sustain your body goes through your nephesh into the rest of your body. Your breathing, the air that comes in, the food, the water, everything. And you really can't know what God will do or how he will bring blessing. It's always a surprise. And you don't realize it often until after it happens. When you reflect back and go, oh, now I see what you did. And it does not mean that God gives you what you want or what you think you need. No, he redeems. He is the Goel. And that is why ultimately he will send his son, Yeshua the Messiah, to redeem all of humanity as a Goel. First for the Jewish people, and also anyone from any nation who calls on the name of the king in the line of David. So they continue and they say, "For your daughter-in-law who loves you and is better to you than 7 sons has given birth to him." Ruth was a gift to Naomi that she didn't even really see until the end, because through her commitment to Naomi, she now has a son, the Goel, to redeem Naomi and save the crazy and broken line of Judah. But first, Naomi herself is restored. Verse 16, it says, Naomi took the child and held it to her bosom and took care of him. And the neighboring women gave him a name, saying, a son has been born to Naomi. So they called him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. Now, Obed means servant, so this is how the story works. Friendship, that's Ruth, friendship the Moabite, and the strong one, Boaz, have a baby named Obed, which means servant. And the bitter Mara can return to being pleasant Naomi because God would do something greater than what she could have imagined. And all of this leads to David, the king. The Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible that's written in Alexandria, Egypt, and between the 2nd century BCE and the 4th century CE. And in that time, Ruth was placed by Jewish translators in between the book of Judges and the book of 1 Samuel. It's a bridge in the story between a time when there were judges and no kings, and a time where there was a king of Israel. And right in the middle of it is the story of Ruth, which bridges hope from Judges, where everyone did what was right in their own eyes. There was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. And the story that leads to King David in 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings. Daniel Block in his commentary writes this: Ruth is then a testimony to the blessing that comes to those who will live in faithful covenant relationship with God, that is Chesed, and to God's providential hand upon the house of David. See, it's later in 2 Samuel when the prophet Nathan God made a promise through the prophet Nathan that David's seed would sit on this throne forever. Not just over Israel, but ultimately over the whole world through a son. It says in 2 Samuel 7 and verse 12, when your days are done and you sleep with your fathers, I will raise up your seed who will come after you from after you, and I will establish his kingdom. And he will build a house for my name, and I will establish his royal throne forever. And then verse 16 says, so your house and your kingship will be secure forever before you, and your throne will be established forever. It's amazing because it's another hyperlink to the blessing that Jacob prayed over his son Judah, at the start of the tribe that everyone in the story of Ruth is a part of, with a prophecy about a king. Genesis 49 verse 10, it says, the scepter will not pass from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until he to whom it belongs will come. To him will be the obedience of the peoples. And the author of Ruth connects the dots with this genealogy to end the story that leads right to the king of Israel, a member of the tribe of Judah and a member of a clan of Boaz, even one who's born in the city of Bethlehem itself, which will later be called the city of David. And the phrase that kicks off the genealogy is in chapter 4 and verse 18. These are the generations of. This is so cool. The point that the author of Ruth is making is a hyperlink to the book of Genesis. It's like Genesis was on his mind the whole time. The Hebrew word toledot means generations, and it's like an account of a man and his descendants. Like these are the generations of. And these are the generations of appears 10 times in the book of Genesis. In fact, it divides the book of Genesis into 10 sections. And Ruth follows with the same word, the same sentence, as if the author of Ruth had Genesis in mind. Ruth 4, verse 18, it says, these are the generations of Perez, who fathered Hezron, and Hezron fathered Ram, and Ram fathered Ahmadinejad. It sounds like Ahmadinejad, it's not. Ahmadinejad fathered Nahshon, and Nahshon fathers Salmon, and Salmon fathered Boaz, and Boaz fathered Obed, and Obed fathered Jesse, and Jesse fathered David. And do you know that the word David is the last word of the book of Ruth, and that the genealogy lists 10 people from Perez, the son of Judah, to David. And there are only 2 other times in the entire Hebrew scriptures where there are genealogies that have 10 people. And they are Genesis 5, which shows 10 generations from Adam to Noah, and Genesis 11, which shows 10 generations from Noah to Abram, and Ruth chapter 4, which shows 10 generations from Perez to David. The Bible Project says it like this: it's an indication that a new age was beginning. As it did with Noah and then with Abraham, so too it would with King David. See, the author of Ruth is saying that David is equal in importance, if not even more central, than Adam and Noah and Abraham. And David is the last word of the book of Ruth, because this new age is going to begin, where the king who was promised to sit on David's throne forever will be born in the city of Bethlehem, the house of bread, a Goel, a redeemer for Israel first, and also for anyone from any nation that calls on the name of his son. And that is where the Gospel of Matthew picks up the story. It seems that the author of Ruth had Genesis on his mind, and it seems that Matthew, writing in Greek, had Ruth and Genesis on his mind. So Matthew introduces the very first sentence of the New Testament in the first gospel with the same phrase that's found in Genesis 10 times and in Ruth chapter 4, the book of the genealogy of Yeshua HaMashiach ben David ben Avraham. The same phrase, here the book of the genealogy of, which signifies a new age in the story of the Jewish people. You know, in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Torah, the word toledot in Greek is Genesis. It means the birth, or the start of. So Matthew in Greek uses the same phrase the Septuagint uses all through the book of Genesis 10 times. It's like he's saying, here is the genesis of Yeshua the Messiah. Yeshua means salvation. It's a variation of the name Joshua. The Lord is salvation. Yeshua literally means salvation, and Messiah means anointed one in Hebrew. In Greek, it's Christos, Christ. They both mean anointed one in Greek, one in Hebrew. Anointed for what? Anointed to be king of Israel in the line of King David and Judah. The first century expectation, 500 years from the Babylonian captivity, is the Messiah, the anointed one, will come and sit on the throne of David. So Matthew intentionally uses the same phrase found in the Torah to describe new ages and new stories in the narrative of Israel, to introduce Yeshua the Messiah, the genesis of Yeshua the Messiah, who is the son of David and the son of Abraham. But the son of David, this is so wild. The son of David, who Israel has been waiting for 2,000 years up to that point. And the king we've been waiting for is being born. Specifically, it's who Israel had been waiting for the last 500 years. For David to sit on the throne again. For the prophecy of David's descendant to sit on the throne forever, as God promised. You know, the actual kingdom of David only lasted for 500 years. From David to the Babylonian exile. The last king in the line of David was brought captive to Babylon along with the rest of the people. And when we returned to Israel after 70 years, and some would return from the exile, that for 500 years there was no king on the throne of David. Because Judea is constantly under occupation for 500 years. When we come back from the Babylonian captivity, we're set free by Cyrus, who rules Persia. So from 538 to 333 BCE, Judea is ruled by Persia. In 333 BCE, Alexander the Great arrives and rules Judea. In 320 BCE, the Ptolemies and the Seleucids rule, with Antiochus Epiphanes of the Seleucids. And of course, in 164 BCE, the Hasmoneans defeat the Seleucids, and the reign of as rogue kings who are not in the line of David begins with the Maccabees. In 63 BCE, just 63 years before the birth of Yeshua, Rome is invited by the Hasmoneans to occupy Judea. So, in the midst of Roman oppression and the occupation of Judea by Rome, Matthew introduces the genesis of the king, the son of David, the son of Abraham, that in the first century, as it is today, all Jewish people would be descendants of Abraham. But to also be a descendant of David and to be born in the city of Bethlehem, as the prophet Micah prophesied, is still a deeper connection. Do you know that in ancient Hebrew, each letter of every Hebrew word had a numerical value because letters are also numbers. And so you could take the letters and add them up with numerical value. And do you know that in Hebrew, the word David has a numerical value of 14? So when you look through the genealogy of Matthew chapter 1, what Matthew plays off of is the numeric value of David. And he breaks the genealogy into 3 groups of 14, which is David's name. There are 14 generations from Abraham to David, and 14 generations from David to the Babylonian exile, and 14 generations from Babylon exile to Yeshua the Messiah. And Matthew is clearly skipping some people, because the facts aren't important as much as the number 14 is important. Because it's like Matthew saying, David, David, David. Yeshua is the son of David, which means he is King Mashiach, the one who will come reign in the line of David. You could also take those 3 sets of 14, and you could say that there are actually 6 groups of 7. 7 being an important number all the way back to Genesis chapter 1. That these 6 groups of 7 would make any Jewish person think of Genesis chapter 1 and the 6 days of creation, with the culmination of creation being on the 7th day. So there are 6 groups of 7, and the 7th group begins with one person, Yeshua, the Messiah, the son of David. N.T. Wright says it like this: to be born at the beginning of the 7th 7 in the sequence is clearly to be the climax of the whole list. This birth, Matthew is saying, is what Israel has been waiting for 2,000 years. And as you look through the genealogy, for the first time, genealogies in the scriptures, you see the addition of women, 4 women specifically that we are familiar with: Tamar, Rahab, who apparently, according to Matthew, is Boaz's mother. Of course, Ruth, and the wife of Uriah, who is Bathsheba, Solomon's mother. And you know, all 4 of these women are Gentiles. All have suspicious origins. And all built the house of Israel and saved the tribe of Judah and the whole world by their actions. God keeps his promises. And he always keeps his promises in surprising ways for those who trust in him. You have to hear what I'm saying. God keeps his promises, and he does it in surprising ways for those who trust in him. Why? Because God works through Jews and Gentiles, men and women, to accomplish his will and plans, and he always has. And you, my friends, and I can be filled full in Yeshua. That even when things are darkest, there is still light. And even when we are weakest, there is strength in Yeshua. And even when you feel empty, God will restore. And even when you feel like you can't wait anymore, just keep waiting. It may not all play out the way you want, or maybe even think the way you need. But the truth is, God has a better, more surprising way that he will meet our needs in ways we could not even imagine would have ever happened. Because God is still moving, and he loves to meet his people's needs in the most wonderful and surprising ways. After all, we've been saying it for 6 weeks. If God worked through the hurting, broken, selfish, manipulating people like Naomi, Ruth, and Boaz, how much greater that he is still working through hurting, broken, selfish, manipulating people just like you and me. I pray that you would be filled full, not just for the things you think you want or the things you think you need, but in ways that you could have never imagined that only God can do. And I pray that if you're watching and you've never received Yeshua as Messiah, that today would be your day of salvation. That you would be filled full with the knowledge of the promised Messiah of Israel, our King Mashiach, who reigns not only over the Jewish people, but over the whole world entire. That everyone who calls on the name of Yeshua will spend eternity with him. And we pray these things in Yeshua's name. Amen. I love you guys. Thanks for hanging with us through the book of Ruth, and I can't wait to see it in our next series.